Hello, I'm Jeff, Executive Vice President here at Amoco Brent. Over 100 years ago, my grandfather founded Amoco. Today, my brother and I carry on his legacy. Our team works diligently to bring you the best clays, glazes, equipment, and more for your studio and classroom. This week's episode is brought to you by Amoco Brent. Please find your favorite Amoco or Brent product at your local distributor today. Thank you for choosing Amoco for all your clay and glaze needs.
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 460 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm talking with Sana Musasama. Her career spans over 4 decades and is a unique blend of art making, teaching, and activism. In this interview, we talk about how her travels across West Africa in the mid-1970s set her on a path to understanding other cultures through art making. We also discuss her activism and why it's important to make joyous objects in the light of world events. In addition to her art practice, she has taught at many institutions in New York City, including Hunter College and the City College of New York. For more information, you can visit sana-musasama.com. Before we get to that, I wanted to mention that I'll be during the Clay Center of New Orleans' upcoming exhibition, Less is More. This exhibition is open to ceramic vessels, sculptures, and wall-mounted works, and celebrates earthenware, clay, and low-fire surfaces. The application deadline is April the 15th, so visit nolaclay.org/call for entries to apply today. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So you've traveled the world a lot, but you also live in the home that you grew up in Queens. So I wondered if you could talk about how Queens and how New York City has shaped you as a person.
It's a good question. I don't really know how it has really shaped me because I feel like I'm from so many places. New York City certainly is home, and the Carolinas is home to my paternal family and maternal family, and I'm in the house I grew up in. But I don't feel connected to the community anymore, and that's been something I've been thinking about greatly, particularly since the pandemic, when I was locked into my community. I'm like 45 minutes from New York City, 10 minutes from Kennedy Airport, and all my jobs have always been Manhattan. So whenever I walk out the front door, I'm going to Manhattan. I always walk out the door and go left. Rarely do I go right, which would be going further into Queens. When I get to the corner, I'm at 193rd Street. I don't know what 194th, 95th, 200th Street looks like. I'm getting the hell out of Queens every opportunity I can because I've outgrown it. It's nucleus family. That's not my lifestyle. There are no clubs. There's no music. For me, that lacks a diversity of experiences. And so I'm bored being here, but it has been a beautiful journey because my family moved here probably in the 40s, and they came from I mean, they came many places, New York, they lived in Harlem, but they came here on a, like a GI plan with my father was in the military. And because of Jim Crow and redlining, there weren't many communities that Black families could live in. And this was one of them. And so it became a hub of a lot of Black families, military base. And then 2 blocks to the left of me, it became a hub for Black entertainers. So Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Count Basie, James Brown, all of them lived in other areas they called Adelaide Park, which is walkable. So you had that community and this community. And I think at that particular time in history, there was this innate survival skill to create what you could create in your own environment, since the other environments were pushing you out. And so growing up, it was alive and active, but the community has changed in 50 years. And the community promised themselves when I was growing up that they would only sell to family or close family. And that's what they did. But it's now 4 generations, not 4 generations, but it is a good 35 years. And those families have died out. And that 3rd generation didn't come home after college. So they never came back. So now I'm in a neighborhood that many people are strangers to me. My girlfriend's children no longer are running up and down the streets that made it feel like home. I could walk out my door and look at a kid and see my girlfriend's face. I don't see that anymore. So I'm not anchored here as much anymore. I have to figure out where to go and what to be. This is economically secure for me. Manhattan would be starting another mortgage, which I'm not interested in. And all of a sudden, moving to Asia doesn't seem sweet anymore after what happened to Effie. I'm scared. So how has New York shaped me? I guess what it's done is it's kind of made me this kind of thick-skinned person that can go anywhere in the world and be kind of fearless. Because in New York, you don't live really in your neighborhood. You live in all the communities. You cross the boundaries and borders of Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan in the course of a day, different communities, different groups, different economics, and all of them I've weaved through very gracefully. So I think what it does is it has given me armor to not be scared, to get on a plane and go someplace else, and to go to that place and find something that echoes where I come from. So I know one of the first things that I do when I travel and get up the next morning and go out, the first thing I ask is, where's a market? Because I know in a market, it's going to be bustling with people buying food, discussing, and I know it's going to be dominated with women. And in these markets, I'm going to make a woman friend, and she's going to have a child, a daughter, and that daughter is going to become my guide, my language teacher, and everything unfolds from there. So I guess what New York has given me is this unstoppable drive and fearlessness to go other places.
Yeah, I think sometimes the instinct when traveling is to find people that speak your language or that you can relate to in some way. But you've talked about, and I've listened to other interviews and lectures you've given about being in these markets where you don't necessarily speak the language, or if you do, you don't speak it that well. But you talked about how the younger people are the ones that are the conduit to the culture. Why do you think that is? Is it just because of the innocence of youth? They're more open, or what's the connection there?
I think it's a combination of things. In my experiences, well, children are deeply curious, period, all the time, wherever you go. And difference is something they're intrigued by and not necessarily feared by, and so that's what I found. And so I can sometimes in a place, I can go to, like, for example, in Vietnam, when I went to the river to wash my clothes, who was there but another little girl washing her parents' clothes. And so here we are doing something without speaking the same language. She understands me. I understand her. She sees me doing something wrong. She figures out I don't know. So she leans in and takes my hand and shows me, tells me where to go. That's our way of talking. We make eye contact. She smiles. She goes home and tells her mother about this strange lady who doesn't know how to wash clothes in the river. Her mother comes the next day to see who this is that's come to their country as an adult who doesn't know how to wash her clothes. And that begins a story. That begins a friendship. So it starts with children, little boys and little girls. But with the little girls, what happens is, because in a lot of these traditional cultures, and their innocence has to be maintained until marriage. Their mothers keep their eyes on them, particularly. They're always sitting really close to them, or they know where they are in the market. And once these mothers see me around the third or fourth day, they begin to say, wait a minute, let's invite her over to sit with us. And I do, and we start to talk. And then they find out a little bit that they can know about me or understand about me moving around the world, traveling. I mean, I'm really abstract, an artist walking around the world, but a common denominator evolves in our talking. I go every day, sit a few minutes. At some point, I'm learned how to count. At some point, I'm bagging the food. At some point, I know the vendor that way, that way. A family feeling develops and trust happens. And when I get ready to leave this place and I say my goodbyes, and they know that I am going north and I will come back that way to go where I have to go to leave the country, they then say, take my daughter. She will keep you safe. She will get the right prices. She's never been out of my eyesight. You're a good woman, Sana. You will protect her. And that's where it starts to unfold. And once that happens, I repeat it over and over and over again, and have done for the last 40 years of traveling. Go to the market, meet a woman, meet her daughter, and go from there. Bring her back safe. And when these little girls are with me, our roles really change like the seasons. And in many cases, they become mommies to me. They do protect me. They do get the right prices for me. They keep men away from me as a single woman traveling by myself, as a Westerner, where I would be looked upon as free and available on my own will or against my will. I mean, it works both ways. And so our roles switch just like the seasons. And in some instances, I become mommy, and I'm more protective when I see something that they may potentially harm themselves.
This idea of changing roles, like that you meet someone, you get to know them, they protect you, you protect them. I think this is the human story. Like I think as human beings, we do travel. I mean, we've evolved and spread all the way across the world. But I want to think about when you're an outsider and what you learn from being an outsider versus being an insider. So, like growing up in your neighborhood in Queens, you said you knew everyone, and that's one way of knowing. But there is a curiosity and an excitement of getting to know people in a foreign country, and I've experienced that myself. So, can you talk about that insider-outsider role, like how you negotiate that as an artist? Because I feel like a lot of this is going to lead up to your art practice, which is commenting on the things you're seeing.
I feel like an insider when I'm with women. Our bodies are the same. We have cycles. We birth. We take care of our children. So I'm very much an insider with that. I guess where I'm an outsider is the way that I'm free to walk around and do exactly what I want to do and when I want to do it. And in many cases, the women I'm with, their lives and the times of the day are dictated in what they must do, or the seasons dictate what must be done in terms of harvesting. And so I'm fluid and free as an outsider. And that can be both a blessing and a burden, in the ways that it's a burden for that culture sometimes. And I'm aware of it and sensitive to it, is that my presence of being an independent woman moving around the world without a child, without a mate, gives a girl in a traditional culture maybe an illusion that she can do the same thing, which is damaging, because she can't. And so I'm aware of that as an outsider, that my influence, intentionality is only royalty and good and love and share. But the backdrop of that is misleading as well as an outsider. The insider part is really that we are all members of the human race. We're one. And I think I'm looking for that common denominator when I travel, that oneness. Now, my navy blue passport certainly makes a distinction. My dark brown skin and kinky hair and my features also make divisions. But, as a Black American, outsider, insider, relationships is all I ever really know, to be honest with you. It's been my life. I'm inside and outside all the time. This is what it's been. It's so natural and sometimes maybe dangerous in its naturalness because I've embraced something normal that should not be normal and moving around in the world as a brown person. I've accepted things that my nieces and my grandnieces will not tolerate. Absolutely not. When I've embraced it and rolled with it, because generationally for me, it was easier to do it that way.
I heard you talking about the traveling you did in West Africa. What country were you in your 20s? What country was that?
I arrived in Ghana and traveled the coast all the way to Sierra Leone, where I then stayed for I say 4 seasons, but I stayed about maybe 10 months. But I arrived in Ghana and just went up along the coast, and I did everything with a friend, and we did it by land. So I meandered through lots of places and stayed a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. But it's in Sierra Leone that I anchored and became grounded and got involved as much as I could as an outsider in the culture that was there. I was called in Mendeland, Sierra Leone, I was called Pamoy. And I was called that by the children. And when I would go to ask my friend who invited me into his village what Pamoy meant, the first time I asked him, I could see in his face that it wasn't a compliment that they were calling me. And he said, never mind, don't listen to that. But I just was persistent because they kept calling. And I could tell that it wasn't really nice because they would say it from the corner of the hut or around a tree and then run off. So I figured it's a pretty bad word. But it didn't turn out to be so terrible. It meant black skin, white land, no roots.
Oh.
So I was considered a Black American that had lost their roots to the tree. So that's what Pamoy meant in his village. I was very much an outsider in his village, but I didn't feel like it. I was. And because village life is so intimate, I soon learned the death song, what it meant, and that somebody had died and where to go. I knew when somebody was going to birth. I knew when harvest time was. I knew when it was pottery time. I just pushed my way into all these things in a very graceful kind of a way. I never was told not to do this or not to do that, but I was always aware of my place as a woman in a culture that gender is, in my opinion, restricted. So who became my buddies were little girls and little boys, but predominantly little girls because they were more curious. And because gender is separated, I probably could have attracted a little boy, but not 45 years ago in these places where boys were here and girls were there. They didn't overlap. They didn't overlap, not very much at all. Women were with women, men were with men. And I was traveling with a guy, and it was always interesting. He, of course, went to the guy's side. And of course, I stayed with the women, but I was always curious about the guys on the guy's side, And so I said to myself, Sana, you have the luxury of penetrating both of these systems. Get up from these women and walk over to those men and sit right there and show them you come from a place where women and men sit and talk. So that's what I do. I plop over and sit there, and they look at me, and they look at him. To him to say, tell her to go away. And I look at him to say, don't you dare tell me to go away. Don't you dare come here and adopt these African systems that don't exist in our culture. Don't you dare try that. I had to put him in his place a few times because it glorified him. He could have had 3 or 4 girlfriends or wives in a culture and seemed pretty interesting and good. And I mean, wives were offered to him. We'd go into a village and a woman would be offered to him. And I said, yeah, just try it. Just try it. So,
because I wondered about that. You had that experience, which I think was a really valuable experience. But then I heard you say in a lecture, you didn't actually make art about that experience till decades later. I think it was like 19 years later, you started making art about that.
About some of the experiences, yeah.
Which I think is really interesting. The idea that you're going to be in the moment, you're going to live in the moment, but then you're going to take time to digest what it all means, I think is a really valuable thing. So can you talk about that?
Well, with a lot of the experiences that I had as a young traveler, because I was probably in my mid 20s doing this, is that I wanted to be a listener. I wanted to be somebody who was starting my education all over again. And as babies, what do we do when we're really young before we can walk or talk? Is we look and we see and we observe. And so that's what I wanted to be in these cultures. And so I wrote down everything I saw, things that were painful, things that were different. But I wrote them down to study them later on, to understand them, than to judge them. And so I didn't dare talk about or make art about something I didn't understand or hadn't studied. I didn't dare. I had felt like I had no right. I felt like I had no right to talk about cultural experiences that were outside of my cultural arena. So it took all these years of really reading and studying and growing up as a woman and traveling back to these places and asking questions. It would have never happened any sooner than what had happened, which was 19 years later. Also, what helped me is the subject matter that I was concerned about became somewhat worldwide. I began to read about these issues in our papers and realize in our papers, I was in the midst of a ritual and I was oblivious. I didn't know when I was there what was happening. It was only in the papers 15 years, 16 years later that awakened me. Wow, Sana, that's what happened. And then I began to really research it and travel and develop confidence that, yes, Sana, you can talk about this. It's the way you talk about it and honor it. And so many times when I've given the talk, I don't talk about it very much anymore. I've changed my language around it. At one point, it was called circumcision, and now I call it excision because I was asked to honor what they call it, and that circumcision or genital mutilation is a Western term that's derogatory and deems of savage. And when reality, this ritual has many components of it that are embraceable, and not only the parts that's hard to live with, you know. So it took time to grow up, to understand, to learn, to talk about these things. That's really what it was.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable thing. When I think about politicians, like our whole political system is based on pointing the finger at other people and saying you're weird or you're wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're basically saying is like you've been in a culture that did something very different than what we do, and it's would in our culture considered to be a form of violence. But the subtlety of you living through being in that community, you saw it as something different. And I just wonder, like how could we get our political leaders to see the world like that? You know, not other people as dangerous and wrong, but as that cultures develop in the way that they do, and they all have meaning, even if it's not our meaning.
Yeah. I don't know what makes people's antennas soft to other things. I just don't know. Mine are raw. Mine are just raw, but I don't know what makes somebody else totally insensitive. I really don't understand it, you know? I just grew up so open to other things and people and experiences. My father made a career out of the Navy, so this house was always filled with buddies of his coming from many parts of the world, and he spoke other languages. And so I grew up so curious about otherness and never feared it. But sometimes people fear something that's not familiar to them. I see it in my travels, and I understand it a lot better now, but I could never understand 20 years ago how anybody could travel to another country and to make their country in that country. Like only go where the Germans are, only go where the Americans are, only go where the Swedish are, only do clubbing where their own group is, where their own. I could never really understand it. Why would I travel so far to be around people that I know that speak my language and know my system? For me, I wanted to go outside my system. I wanted to go outside my body, outside my experiences. But I do understand it now that people want to feel comfortable too. And sometimes comfort comes from something familiar. You don't have to explain it. They understand it. They get it. Also, I can remember living in Mendeland after 9.5 months of only hearing my head English, my companions English, and a little bit of the Mende language. And I remember one day on a bus, we were going someplace, and the person behind me busted out in laughter. And all of a sudden, that was my language. I jumped around to see an American. You know what I mean? Because they laughed like me. And then I realized, wow, there's something wonderful about hearing yourself. So I understand it now. So when I'm in Cambodia and I turn a corner and it's all Westerners, instead of saying to myself, you creeps, what did you come here for if you're just going to do what you do where you come from? Now I just say, okay, they need to be with them. That's okay. And I go there and I'll eat sometimes and make a brief contact with a friend. But most of the time, what I want to do is go into the unfamiliar. That's what charges me up, something that's unfamiliar and new.
In terms of digesting these experiences and turning them into art, like with the work that was about female excision, like that's a very specific topic. Versus, you made another body of work called the Unknown series, and it was in Cambodia. You had been to the killing fields, which was, I'm trying to think of how to talk around this topic in a sensitive way, but mass death is so overwhelming that it feels less specific. Like it just feels like this huge topic. So how do you translate something like that versus something like the body of work that was about a specific cultural practice? Like, how do you think through those in your head as an artist?
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I think when I visit the killing fields, all the time I went with a Native person. And because the experience I'm having is having an experience that no foreigner is privileged to have, it's more intimate. So when they go to pick up what was a pelvic of someone and put it into a box, I feel what they're feeling. I feel like they're trying to find what they lost, even though it's 45 years ago. It's a loss that never was honored in an individual sense. And so I have a tremendous amount of empathy with them as they do this, because tourists can go into the killing fields anytime after 11, but Native people go in at 5 because they go in to pray. They walk around with a picture of the lost one, and they're trying to find remnants. And sometimes they'll have a picture where the person had on a red shirt. So as we walk in the killing fields, we'll see remnants of red cloth. It maybe is not the cloth of their lost relative, but it's the echo and the memory of it. And so I'm there with them, to be with them. And looking, there's a tomb that's there that's full of skulls. It looks like the Empire State Building. Skulls just go all the way up to the sky. And most of them have a giant hole to the head where they were bunged to death. And I look at each one of them and I see an individual. It's not mass, even though there are hundreds of them. I look at each one of them with those hollowed out eye sockets, and I see a person or a child or somebody who once was. So it becomes really personal. It's not mass, it's individual. When I look on the ground and I see a part of a hip, I visualize the whole body. When I just see a shoe heel, I visualize the foot that was in that shoe. I just feel it. I just feel it.
The body of work that you made about that experience, a lot of the images or a lot of the objects are wrapped, like they feel as if they're wrapped in clay or wrapped in, it looks like cloth, but it is clay. Can you talk about that idea of wrapping or binding as a way to describe that emotional experience of being in that situation?
Well, many things. For one, my friend just had a baby a month ago, and when they brought her baby to her, the baby was wrapped like in a little, do you know what that's called?
Yeah, swaddle.
Swaddle. Just mummified. And I've seen it over and over again. And everyone who's ever seen it or tried to do it said that the babies like it. They feel oppressed. That's what it looks like to me. Oppressed, like a cocoon, and their little faces have popped out. And so there's something comforting about that. And so I think I'm comforting the skeletal remains by reclothing it, because in the killing fields, people were derobed before they were killed. And and put into mass graves where then chemicals were poured on top of the bodies to make the bodies decay faster and cut down on smell. But what remained was a pile of clothing. So in one of these tombs, there is nothing but clothing. Nothing but, from here to the sky, clothing, remnants of clothing, and the impact of looking at skulls and then looking at clothing and then looking at skulls, they had to be. Also, when you're walking around on the ground, you will see fabric. And it's almost as though the fabric lasted longer than the bone in some ways. And so I asked, how can this be that fabric lasted longer than a bone? And I said, well, maybe the dye in it, the chemicals. And so I just remember that when I began to do this body of work, I made the skeletal bodies in nitron wire from the kilns. And then it was just so easy for me to take my sheets and shred them and stick them into different colored slips and then start weaving them through the bodies as though that I was reclothing them to the clothes they had on before they were killed. So that's where it comes from. It comes from derobing and then clothing. And also the echoes of clothing having lasted, of that tomb that's full of clothing. I think that was something that hit me first when I went to the killing fields, is that I looked and said, what's that? And I said, oh, that's the clothes they had on. And I just said, oh my God. And then you go to see the skulls, and then you go to see all the other mass burial sites that are there. There are hundreds of them. And depending upon who's at the killing fields, they're very desensitized to this, something that happened 37 years ago. And so when you leave there, they want to give you maps of all the other killing fields that you can go to for that day. You really can only do one killing field per day, believe me. You can only do one. I took my niece traveled to Cambodia with me, and I took her because I thought that it was an experience that she needed. She had a meltdown. I'll never forget that. She started walking through that place like she was a bullet, bouncing and falling and flipping out over everything. Her shoulders all up in her neck. I had no idea how what me trying to teach her something was hurting her, but it was good for her to see that as a young woman who makes a lot of money, who only travels Club Med, who gets her nails done anytime she wants to, has fancy cars. It was good for her to see how somebody else lives, to know that genocide is a genocide that's happening all the time in many parts of the world. And we're not lucky to get the information, but sometimes that information doesn't come to us when it's happening. I did not know about the Khmer Rouge when it was going on, and I was certainly of age, but I wasn't reading the paper. My mind wasn't geared that way. I want my sister's children to go beyond who they are in the world. They came into the world very, very differently, with two parents that went to college, who had good jobs. And so they don't come from the echo I come from, with parents who were not educated, or grandparents who were not, or even great-grandparents who were enslaved. So sometimes I think when I look at their lives, I just think it's a little too plastic for me, and I want to bring them down a little bit. And also the other reality is I chose the arts, which means when I chose the arts, it meant that I didn't choose a lifestyle that would give me 2 cars, 2 houses, and I chose it by choice. Those are not things that I've ever been interested in, or designer clothes. I laugh to my students when I tell them I've gotten more manicures and pedicures in Cambodia in my life than I've ever done here. More there than I've ever done here, because it's just not a big interest of mine. But I wanted my nieces who possibly see me, nephews who see me as a little off the beaten path, who doesn't care about designer clothes, who doesn't care about having the latest this, whose house looks like a broken down museum. I wanted them to see me in my worlds. And so that's why I invited her to come. It's just that I wasn't fair to understand that She needed my world to be teaspoon fed to her and not shoved down her throat. So big, so it was wrong of me to not take in that consideration. She didn't speak to me for 9.5 months. She left Cambodia. She didn't stay. She left. She got her own ticket and got out. And she didn't speak to me for 9.5 months. And she lives 6 blocks from here. I called, and she just didn't. And I just said, I'm not going to give up on calling. And then I called my sister to explain what happened. And she said, Sana, just give her time. Just give her time. And so she came back in December. And that next November, we get together for Thanksgiving. And she came and picked me up to actually go to her sister's house. And on the way home, she was quiet in the car. And she says, what are you doing for the holidays? And I said, Shalama, I'm in Cambodia. That's my life for the holidays. That's where I'm going. And I said, thank you for giving me the ride, sweetheart. And as I got out the car, she says, you know something? I'm coming with you this year. And I didn't say anything. I just looked at her. She drove off and I said, oh, I got her. And I ran into the house and got her a ticket. And when we went back the next year, she was a trooper. She needed time. She was just fine. But I also knew what to show her in Cambodia and what not. The next year, no killing fields. I did not take her to Somali Mom, where she would see girls who were just coming back from brothels. I didn't take her. I did more of the kind of travel that would be easy for her. I usually cross the border by land because I'm carrying all these supplies and they're very costly to go by air. And it's a venture. You get to the borders of some of these countries, you will feel like you're 1,000 years back in time. Gravel, trucks, ammunition, guns. You just look around and say, where am I? I knew that would pop her bubble. Pop her bubble. So I told her, you fly to Cambodia and I'll meet you in 24 hours. Everybody's waiting for you. They'll pick you up at the airport. You'll be okay. I rehearsed it to make sure she felt comfortable. And she said, I'm fine. She said, when I get out the airport, I'll grab my luggage and I'll get in a cab. She said, nobody else is getting into a cab. So she got into Cambodia at probably about 9 o'clock in the morning. I got in there at midnight. And of course, I darted to the room. The door was open. And she was in there. I said, is everything okay? She says, everything's fine. The next day we were walking through the streets. Everybody knew her. They said, Shalom. And I was like looking at her. How do they know you? She said, I was partying. I said, you were? And I said, good girl. I mean, everybody knew her. She was okay. She had gone out and gone all to the places for happy hour that starts at noon. And sitting on her bar stool, drinking with her newly nails and her designer clothes, just chilling. Just chilling. But she was a trooper. I was so, so proud of her. And there was a little girl that I had met in an orphanage that I fell in love with. And so every year she became a part of Cambodia. When I would go to the orphanage, take food for the children, comb their hair, take lice shampoo because they were full of lice, and just be with them for a few days. And one little girl I really, really fell in love with. So I wanted Shalama to meet her, but I was also concerned about taking her to an orphanage where children aren't clean, where they do have lice. I mean, the lice is crawling around the eyelashes. You know what I mean? They're all sleeping on the same beds. It's almost impossible to get rid of. So I was really cautious about, and it's not clean looking. Our standards, the kids' clothes are the clothes they've been wearing all week. Little girls never have on panties, So I was cautious about taking her there with our previous experience the last year. So I said to her, why don't we go to the orphanage in the morning when I knew most of the kids would be at school, and we would just be around the adults, and I could take her to the library and she could see how beautiful it was, and to the laundry room, and let her just see, and the bedrooms where the girls lived, and let her see. And so we went there, and just a few children were there, the ones that aren't of school age, and we were talking, and the people that I know were in front of me that run the orphanage, and my niece Sean was sitting next to me, and the kids who know me were on this side, and they would climb on me, and I just kept them from going anywhere near her. You know what I mean? Because I didn't want her to flip out, melt down, or even make the kids think that she doesn't like them. So every time they would crawl up on me, I would just navigate them here and talk to them. And she looked and she talked. And then I kept looking at her to make sure she was comfortable. And then finally, we were trying to wait for the little girl I loved to come, and time was going by, and I didn't want that place to all of a sudden be bombarded with 80 kids that live there coming in, And so I said, okay, she's not going to come. Let's kind of go, and maybe you'll meet her another time. And she firmly looked at me and said, no, I came to meet her. We'll stay. So I said, okay. And so we stayed another hour. And then when I looked over, I saw Shrenik coming in on her bike, a bike that I had gotten her. And I said, here she's coming. And so what I did is I got up to meet her halfway and to hug her. And I embraced her. And I said, I want you to meet my special niece. And my niece was like this looking at us. And when I brought Shrenik to her and said, Shrenik, this is my lovely niece, Shalama. Shalama, this is Shrenik. I love her. My niece grabbed her and put her in her arms, and I saw my niece cry. And I just knew she had made another leap. You know what I mean? She had made another leap. She'd come out of her comfort zone of materialism, and she made a beautiful leap. And she hugged this child like it was her own. And then when we got into the tuk-tuk to leave, she yelled at me. So why do you leave her here? Why don't you take her to America? I know you like to travel. Mommy will help you. Let's raise her. Let's raise her. I said, look, young lady, there's nothing wrong with this country. We need to stop taking people from their lands. We need to teach them how to make their lands better. What makes America better for Shrenik than to be where she speaks her language, where her mother's not far? Many children in the orphanages have parents. They just put them in orphanages because they can't feed them. I said, she has a mother. She has a father. She has siblings. Why don't I educate her here in her own country and make it better than swiping her to America, where she learns to hate her country and never wants to speak her language? I said, isn't that better, Shalima? I want to educate her to love her pace. I'll bring her to America, but I'm not going to bring her at this vulnerable age where she'll never come back and only think of herself as a Westerner, and Cambodians are the history of her and not important. I said, that's what's important to me. So if you want to do something, help me educate her. And so we left it at that. We left it at that.
I think this is a good time to talk about the Apron Project, which is a project that you started as a way to have a shared art making experience, but also to have financial support for some of the women that you were working with. And one of the things that I want to distinguish about this is that I feel like some of your work addresses really big problems, and I feel like the Apron Project addresses solutions, like a way to sort of invest in a community through creative practice. So can you talk about that?
Yes, I've been going to Cambodia and working with Somali Moms organization for probably 6 years. And I would go to all these projects of things to do. And a lot of the projects I took were projects that I was working with, had done in an alternative incarceration center. So I was working with a population of kids here, we call them participants, who'd fallen into the felony program. They'd all committed some form of a felony. So me and the art department of this job, along with all the other people that worked there, which were lots of lawyers, lots of art therapists, they did really interesting creative projects with the participants, and I observed them. I did, ceramics and glass making, my things, and they did other kinds of drawings, but more therapeutic things. And so I began to observe these things as art, as a way of healing, but just observe them. And then probably in my 6th or 7th year in Cambodia, and always working by day with Somalis girls, but by evenings I'm a tourist. I walk the streets and I hang out and I try to make friends. And on too many occasions, well, I should say too many, on 1 or 2 occasions, I bumped into a girl that was previously in the safe houses, Somali, but had done her time in the safe houses and was out on her own. And by the way that she was dressed, I could see that she had been re-entered into the sex industry, just by the way that they're dressed. And it perplexed me and bothered me. And I saw it one other time, and this time I decided to address the girl about it. And without going into details, she had re-entered the sex industry because there was no other way to make a living. And her last words to me when I walked away from her in the market was, Sana, I know surrender, which means one day she'll get her life back. But what I began to look at and see very carefully is that when the organization rescues a girl between the ages of 3 and about maybe 11, that child has a much better success rate of healing from the trauma, getting the meds that they need, the therapy that they need to bounce back and be reintegrated into normal society, like go back to school. But when they've been rescued at 13, 18, 21, 23, and spent a significant time of their life in a brothel, they don't know how to read or write. They should have been in a classroom. And so those are the girls that Somali can't bridge the gap on all those years. They can't take them and put them in a remedial program at 21 and their last education experience was 4th grade. They just can't. There is no GED. There is no equivalent. And so those girls will learn the fundamentals of cooking, fish farming, self-defense, gardening, weaving, and a few other crafts, hairdressing, but it's not enough to sustain them. And so what happens is that a hiccup happens in their life, and they know that sex work is a business in Asia. It's an institution in Asia, right or wrong. It's an institution, and it becomes a choice that this is what I'll do to feed my children. And so then that's when I decided that I would not work with the ones that were going to succeed because of their youth, but work with the ones that possibly would fall through the cracks. So I developed the Apron Project for the mature girls that got rescued too late to really, really succeed. Some will go off to, many that get rescued at 9, 10, end up being college graduates. But none of the girls that ever got rescued at 13 to 21 ever went beyond dire poverty. Happy girls, free girls, not being abused, some married, but they're very, very, very poor. There's a lovely girl, Ren, who was my daughter. I loved Ren very, very much. And I met her when she was probably about 15. And she was my Khmer teacher. And I've known her now. I met her at 15, she's 33. Poverty. You hear me? Poverty, poverty. And sometimes it breaks my heart because I look at her home, I look at her children, I look at her, toothache, face swollen, a cut that never got stitched. And I just say, God, what are you doing in this country, Sana, if you're not changing anything? If she can't go and get the abscess drained, why the hell are you doing some fucking apron project? It's not doing anything. So I get so perplexed and crazy about being ineffective. But then again, my mother always had this beautiful expression. I know it's not hers, but lives are not saved in bundles. They're saved one by one. And so maybe one by one, with the girls that I have that are between 8 and 12 in my project, maybe one by one, I'm changing their lives. But the two that I'm closest to because I know them the longest, I don't see where I've changed Ren's life very much. She would disagree, but this year they weren't allowed to bring their children around me because I just wanted to be safe. And their children always have viruses and colds regardless of the pandemic. And so this was their first time ever being away from their children. Their children were with their mothers. But the last day that I was there, I heard footprints on the playful ground, and I heard laughter, and I looked down the roads, and here were the grandmothers coming with the children, and the children who know me, I've known them since birth, and no shoes, rotten teeth, no panties, just poor clothes that don't fit them, that are pinned on them, just poor. And I look at them, I hold them, and I just have to exhale, I just have to exhale. But I won't stop doing the project, and it's not enough money for any of them to live off. It's sustainable. They have to have something else. It's just poor Ren doesn't have anything else. Some of the other girls do have other businesses. She doesn't have anything else. She's the poorest one out of all of them. And I can't quite figure out why Ren can't jumpstart herself. But I spoke to Somali this year about Ren, and she says, Sana, she says, I think it's just personality. I just think it's personality. She says, Kim, the other one that's the manager, is always reinventing herself, always coming up with something else to sew, always going to the market. If no one will come to her as a tailor, she'll pick up her machine and go to the market and pay $10 for two weeks and sit there. Unstoppable. Ren doesn't really have that thing. And I say to Ren, stay close to Kim. She's got great ideas. You guys sit around, think about things, think out the box. And she says, I'm not clever. I'm not clever. I'm not clever. And I said, but you're good with money. You balance the books. We shop really well. Think, what can we do to change Bryn's life? What can we do? But it, I'm it. I'm it. I'm it. She just hasn't. So the Apron Project really saves Bryn's life, and it's certainly not enough. Maybe it's $40 a month.
And we should describe that in the project you're bringing fabrics to them. They're making aprons that are that you then bring back. Then that money goes back to them. So that
No, it doesn't go back to them.
Okay.
They are always paid outright for anything they
gotcha.
do.
Up front.
They never have to wait. They can't afford to wait. They can't afford for me to take 50 aprons from them and bring them to New York and sell them and wait. I pay them outright. So when I'm bringing the aprons here, the girls have made their money from them, and then I wait to make my money back. Yeah, that's how it works. They never have to wait, never have to wait. And it's gotten to the point now that, particularly with the pandemic and not being there 2 years, I sent money, Western Union, to them to go to the markets and buy fabric, and they did really wonderful. I brought home lots and lots of items this year that they made, and they went beyond me. They started making computer bags and yoga mat bags and things like that. So
what I wanted to think about though is that you said that you're in the middle of this project and you're wondering, is it working? And then you had to reassure yourself, like, maybe it is working, but it's just for one person at a time. And I think this is very common in activism is that the work you're doing to create this program takes an emotional toll on you, you know, and a lot of the art you make takes an emotional toll on you. So I wanted to end our conversation thinking about how you as an artist make the work you do. Like, I guess I'm thinking about, how do you take care of yourself when making work about such a heavy subject?
Because I think I'll begin to answer that by saying, because I'm a human being and I'm telling a human story, and I'm telling a story that can be repeated over and over again, because this is what we are as human beings. And the other element about this is that by day I'm with the girls, but by night I have to return to Sana. Otherwise I can't get up the next day and go back to the girls. I can't. And the first year that I went to Cambodia, not knowing that I had it in me to work with a 4 or 5-year-old that had been raped, I didn't know if I could do it. So at cases where I worked in the felony program, I went to an art therapist and I said, look, I need you to come to Cambodia with me. I can't pay your airfare, but I can take care of your meals and I can take care of hotel. But I can't pay your airfare. That's the big one, the $2,000. I can't do that. But I need somebody that I've observed calm my kids down when they're giving me a hard time or when they're violent or angry or hurt. I've watched you come in and say the right word at the right time and calm them. I need you for me in Cambodia. Think about it. And this woman, Jessica, said, she had heard of my travels. She said, you want to actually travel with me? I said, yes, I want you to travel with me. And she said, I would be delighted. And so the first year she went with me because I felt that at night I would have a meltdown every single night because I didn't know the culture. I didn't know anybody. I didn't have the confidence to run to a market. And I just thought the day would kill me. And at night I would just be a vegetable in my room. So, but the first time that we went into the safe houses, and we arrived in there together, and they walked me into the back room of a classroom. And I don't know why they did that, but they walked me into the back of a classroom. And so when I walked in, all I saw was the back of little white blouses and blue skirts. And then the man who was there, said something in Khmer, and they turned around and they looked. And when they turned around and looked at me, and it was like this, instead of looking like 12, 13, 14, 15, they looked like babies. Their face was the face of babies. And I started hyperventilating and getting really scared. And my voice started cracking. And he kept saying, talk, Sana. And I kept opening my mouth to talk, and I couldn't talk. And then I turned to Jessica and I said to her, Jessica, I can't talk. Please help me. And she did something so beautiful. She took my hands and she stood in front of me, but she leaned to the side so they could see me. And she just said, "This is Sana Musasama. I met her in New York City. She's come here and brought me to work with you to make art because she loves you." And I felt the energy from her hands holding me go into my body. And I relaxed. And the children just came up to us and started holding one finger at a time and touching us and saying, "Come to my room," because they all learn English, "Come to my room." And so what happened to me 2 or 3 days later, working with them on the floors, the tile floors and the clay floors, making dolls, because the project I went with them first was to make dolls, because a project that we do at Cases is that we bring in a doll that's just a blank form to the girls, and the doll has two faces, no faces, but a back and a front. And we say to them, one side of this doll is who you were. The other side of the doll is where you're going. And these girls I watched with the art therapist do this project for 3 months. It's transformable. I never played with dolls. I never liked them, but I would watch a violent, angry 12, 13, 14-year-old come to life with a doll. So after I learned about Somali, I grabbed a globe and went into the classroom at Cases the next day. And I said, and I read her story that was in the Glamour magazine. I read it to them. And then I showed them in the world where Cambodia was. And these girls looked at me and I showed them a picture of her. And I said, "Sana, she's not Black." I said, "No, she's Cambodian." I said, "And Sana, she's light skinned and has straight hair." I said, "Yeah." I said, "So atrocities happen to people that don't always look like us. They happen to many peoples. I know that maybe you were pigeonholed, spotlighted. Maybe the crime that you're here for, you really didn't do. Or maybe Brown got you in here. But I want you to grow up knowing that atrocities happen everywhere in the world, not just to you." And so they got real quiet, real quiet. So I ran and got the art therapist, said, "Kids, they're acting really quiet. Help me with them. I don't know what they're going to do." And she came back in and they talked to them. And what they decided to do is they said, "Sana, these girls were never little girls. Why don't we make them dolls like we did?" And I said, "Great idea." So they made about maybe 15, 20 dolls. And then I went to Pearl Paint and brought 50 more. And that was the first project that I did. And so after the third day in Cambodia, where 5 and 6 girls would work on a doll, I looked up at Jessica and said, "I'm never going to stop coming here. I'm coming for the rest of my life." The girls gave me power. They were singing, they were dancing, they were loving each other. What they had been through is atrocity. You could see the chain link indentation on their ankles, the burn marks on their bodies, the cuts on their bodies where they fight a pimp and they get beat for it. Their bodies are a roadmap of violence. They can sing and dance. What the fuck is my problem? You know what I mean? Yeah. So that's why I go, and their stories become more of the dancing and the singing and the laughter and what they are now than what they came from. So when I'm around the 8 girls in Cambodia, when I sit and look at them now, and now they're in their 30s, and I sit around and look at them and look at their bodies and see the echo of what was, it's blurred, and who they are now and where they're going becomes present. I listen to the smiles. I look at the things that we do cross-cultural that they never did before. Cambodia, you don't hug. My girls hug. They learned how to hug. Cambodians don't dance outside of the traditional dance. They learn to dance because at some point or another, I blast their music and I grab them when we get out on the dirt floor and I just make them move. You know what I mean? So those things are what keep me going. Those things keep me from hurting, even though the subject matter is hurting. But also speaking out, talking back is also healing. To talk back and expose something that hasn't been exposed that's evil gives you a form of power. I feel like I'm telling on them. I'm telling on your rotten history. I'm letting the world know about your rotten history. You can't lie anymore. So it all empowers me and has made me a little bit stronger. But with the pandemic, I became depressed and very, very unhappy and began to have many, many regrets in my life. And so I decided that these subject matters are things that I don't want to dwell on anymore. I don't want to talk about female excision. I don't want to talk about the unknown, unnamed. I don't want to talk about, I've never made work about sex trafficking. I want to more find joy in my life. I'll be 72 next month. This is the last chapter of my life. It is the last chapter. In this chapter, more joy. So the body of work I'm working on now are dolls, topsy-turvy dolls that really make you smile and laugh. And they're still social political in the content, but they're not coming from a horror story. But that's what's kept me safe with drowning in these subject matters, is that every girl soldier I've ever met, or any girl that was forced to be a sex worker, there's life after that. And they taught me that there's life after it.
Well, I appreciate you being willing to talk about these things today.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to say that the title of the dolls is the I See Me. Is that the series, I See Me?
No, that's another series. The ones that are about joy, but the I See Me is they call topsy-turvy dolls.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah.
And it's a historical doll, antebellum doll. Do you know about the topsy-turvy doll?
I do. I recently talked to Joey Quinones about this idea.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like what you explain what that is.
Okay, one second.
Okay, sure.
Okay, so here's a topsy-turvy doll. And this is one that I got in Carolinas when my family started dying, and my family didn't talk about enslavement. They didn't want us to hear about it. So we didn't hear about it growing up. We heard a little bit about the migration, but when the kids entered the room, the migration story stopped. But in cleaning out the homes, I found dolls, topsy-turvy dolls. And so there's a story about a doll that's both black and white. And so they were made by, there are many stories about them, but the story that I embrace because it makes more sense to me is that they were made by enslaved house slaves, women who were brought into the house to be a domestic, at the same time a companion to the master's wife. And historically, these women became property of the master. So he raped them anytime he wanted to. They got pregnant and they had children, and their children, which were biracial, grew up in the master's house. But they were enslaved. Enslaved children weren't allowed to have toys, books, anything like that. They played with sticks and rocks like most children will do. The enslaved mother saw the joy that her daughter or son saw in playing with the dolls of the master. So they very brilliantly came up with a doll that had a black face and a white face. And they taught their daughters that when the master's around, you only play with this. He'll assume she's playing with his daughter's doll, which is really her sister, because they're all related. They just don't know. But when the master's not around, mommy wants you to look at you. And so it was a story of resistance in a time when hope was probably diminished every hour of everybody's life. And so what a beautiful story of a mother wanting her daughter to have a normal life during slavery. What a beautiful story about flipping it and turning it into self-love. And so instead of doing it based on black and white, I decided to do it on women that are popular in my life or have been guides in my life. So they became, writers and dancers or performers or even relatives that had monumental impact on me. And instead of a doll that you played with from up and down, my dolls go onto a wall and they spin slowly. And so you begin to see two views of them. And so that's what they became for me. And so they're social political, and that the women are social politically aware and active. Zora Neale Hurston, Edmona Lewis, Augusta Savage, Audre Lorde, all of these are powerful women. And so it is social because they were activists in many of their ways, and they were trying to flip society in the time that they lived. And then the other doll that popped up in between this doll, I started 14 years ago and just came into so many technical problems. I just figured, damn, Sana, you know how to make a doll, so I'm going to figure out how to make the damn thing go round. But boy, oh boy, I ended up with engineers, architects, everybody, the plumber, Home Depot. Everybody was trying to help me with these dolls. It turned it into monumental. So in between struggling with them, whenever I would struggle and get just exasperated, I'd have an engineer come. Great idea. Get this equipment, this battery. He's gone. It doesn't work. Get another one. This battery. I could have gone into the battery business. You hear me? Motor business. I had so many of them. So then to keep myself from being crazy, I went to the I See Me dolls, and they're a story about growing up with in this neighborhood, which was a Navy-based community, and a lot of the military men, when they would go off to service, they'd come home, and they'd come home with a wife of another nationality. And so the next generation of children were mixed children, and beautiful. All of us were beautiful, but beautiful children. And what happened during probably 12, 13, 14 in the block is when we all start realizing, oh, I like a boy, or I like a girl. I saw that the boys only went for the biracial girls that had the lighter skin, the pointy nose, the skin lips, and the wavy hair. And I saw colorism for the first time, and it hurt my feelings. And I grew up in a generation where there was not very much self-love and self-pride. In fact, I can remember growing up that if somebody called you Blackie, that was equivalent to saying your mother's a bitch, and you would try to kill them because the worst thing to do was to be Blackie. The worst thing was to be. And I can just remember just being out on the stoop and a kid riding by on a bike and looking and said, "You're Blackie," just like that. It was just as what we did. Maybe I even did it. I don't remember, but I do know being under attack for being dark brown and having my features when, the Nortons were light skinned with cross-breeded hair, and the guys only went after them. And so I sulked about it, that my beauty was not acceptable, and my mother saw it. And she, one day when I was sulking about it, she asked me, and I grew up in a crowded household, 5 sisters, extended family, and we sat right here, and she said, "What's going on?" I said, "Well, the guys like girls with light skin and pretty hair." And she got very, very quiet, and she went upstairs, and she came back down with all these combs, brushes, wood, sticks, and we sat here and we made a doll. And I sat next to her, and I had no interest in dolls ever, but I had really loved that growing up in a crowded household. I had mommy right beside me and her for 2.5 hours as she played with this doll and had more fun than me. I just would sit here and look at her, and she was having a ball, carving the eyes out, gluing this in, doing that. And I just looked at her having a ball, and she would look down at me and say, "Let's do the skin. Let's put some little makeup on." And she said, "You have pretty skin, son." I said, "Okay." And when that doll was finished, she looked at that doll and she said, "Look at this doll." And she said, "Isn't it beautiful?" I said, "Yeah, mommy, it is beautiful." And she said, "And so are you. And don't you ever forget that you are beautiful. You're unique and you are beautiful." So that's why I call them I See Me dolls, because I make them based on the doll she made with me that looks like me. So that's where that comes from. So that's a little bit of a up than soldiers and genocide, and
Well, it's also just such a full circle moment where a experience you had with your mother as a child then comes back in the way that you're helping with other children and in the art that you're making now. Like the doll has become, a big part of your practice.
It really has. It really has. I've made up about 40 of those dolls, and I were lucky enough to put 13 in an exhibition in August. I had a show with them, and they were beautiful, spinning around on the walls. But I got another 30 to figure it out, and I'm not looking forward to it. But I have to get a big grant because I have to take it off my hands now. I made the dolls. Somebody do the rest. Somebody come, just take them off my hands.
So I've got to know, how did you fix the mechanical part? Like, is it a motor in the back that makes them spin?
There's a motor that's in the back that's attached to a wall piece that makes them spin. So let me just see if I don't think I may have one here. Yeah, I do. So here's one right here. So this is one of the girls. This is Zara Neale Hurston right here. And this is Sojourner Truth.
Wow.
Right here. Both women informed by each other, both political symbols, both heroines of mine. And see, what's in the back is an opening.
Okay.
And a dowel. This gets pushed.
Okay.
And then the motor turns it around. That's how this works. So some have a cubicle that is a wooden frame, because it was my intention that the doll would be here, but all the information about her life would be in sepia in the background. So I have 4 that go in wooden mounts. And then with the next engineer, he refused to work with the idea of the last engineer. He went and got his own damn motors. And so the doll here is just on the wall, and you can kind of see the motor behind. It's not my favorite, but it worked. At this point, 14 years, it worked. So when they're done, there'll be 2 ways. And I'm going to get another engineer to do the rest. He's going to probably come up with another damn idea, and I'm going with it. Just get them working. You know what I mean? Just get them working. Just get them working. That's it. And then I'd love to be able to show all of them in a room one day, and I'd like to employ music with them or prose with them and just make it a performative.
And that slow spinning movement is so beautiful to watch them as they're going. But you did mention in passing actually that like that project was 14 years. And a lot of your projects or the bodies of work go over a really long amount of time, years and years and years.
Yeah.
So I wanted to contrast that with something like you have a piece in the show, or a couple pieces in the show at the New York Historical Society, which is a show that's in reaction to Thomas Comereau, who was enslaved. Well, he was actually a free potter in New York City in the late 1800s. So how do you think about like a specific artwork about that? That's very much about a person and a time and a place versus, say, taking 14 years to make this body of work on the dolls. Like, how does your thought process differ between the two?
With Thomas Comereau, he was brought to my attention through a potter friend that I've known for probably about 30 years, Mark Shapiro. And Mark's a potter, and I've always been more of a sculptor, but his excitement in this art has tweaked my curiosity. And so he began to send me information about this person. And so I began to read about him. And then when I first saw images of him, I realized that I've been seeing images of his work in collections, just never knew who he was. Like I didn't know who the collections that he was with, but I've seen the pots. And so then digging deeper into his life and understanding it, I saw parallels in our lives. That he went to Sierra Leone, being discontented with America. I went there to find myself. He came back unnourished from his experience. That I came back full. He was an activist. I am an activist. He, I believe, passed. They didn't know he was Black until 2003. I could never, ever visually pass. Everybody in the world, wherever I go, calls me African. Nobody believes it until I show my navy blue passport that I'm American. So he's a potter. He embraced clay. I embrace clay. He salt fires. I salt fired. He made things for everyday use. I've always felt that this idea of function goes far beyond utilitarian use. That function is something that eats into the heart. And my pieces are just as functional as a bowl or a cup that somebody eats out of every day, because it informs you, you feel something, and you feel propelled, and you feel nourished. So all those parallels I felt were concrete enough to begin thinking about him. And I think I thought of the word of him, so much of identity. Well, so much of my experience has gone through multiple forms of identity. My parents grew up. I'm burning up a pot over here, which is a ritual I do all the time. So I grew up. My parents grew up, and they were colored, or Negro, or nigger, or Blackie, and then with the 50s and 60s, we became African Americans, and then became Black Americans. And then we became African cosmopolitan or Black cosmopolitan. All of these shifts I migrated through as a person. Each one of them was painful for my mother to evolve, me to evolve, but at the same time, they were transitional lift in another direction. And so I think I feel empowered by these shifts and movements at the same time that they're hurtful, but I want to just take the power component of it and move forward with it. So he had multiple identities. He had to persevere. for him to not have been discovered that he was Black until 2003 means that he was probably very fair skinned, with very silky kind of hair. But still, his work, his love thrust for the people that could not pass like he could. And that's what he devoted his life to. So all of that humanized the story and made Thomas somebody that I would have liked to have met. And so in making these pieces, we met. And so my pieces are, they kind of like have chambers in them, a form that's repeated. All of those are memory vessels of the changes that we go through as human beings while we're here on the planet, movement, containers of hope. They also echo the cargo that human beings came to from the continent, human cargo. That's something that's always stayed in my mind, that image of of Africans lined up in the belly of the ships coming across the transatlantic, and how horrible that was. So all of that was able to inform these three sculptures that are there. Weaving his story and my story.
And that show's going to be up. I didn't look at the dates, but do you know how long that will be up at the
May.
Historical Society? Till May.
May,
Okay.
May, and then it's going to travel. They say it's going to travel. I'm sure many venues will pop up along the way, but it's there until May, and then it's going to travel. I don't know that my pieces will travel with the exhibit, but it's something I'm going to inquire about this week, that it should travel with the exhibit. And also, when it does travel, I'd like to have more input in the installation of it. The show is upstairs on the second floor, and I'm downstairs on the ground floor. You will completely miss me unless somebody completely miss me. I mean, you'll see the pots, but you won't make the connection to the show. You will not. But that, by the time I was brought in on it, that room has already been designed by an architect, what to do, how to do it years in advance, that there just was no place, or there wasn't even a thought of getting a Black American artist to be inspired. So I rolled with the punches of where it is, but it's a little disconnected. In the exhibit room, there's a little wall text and with the visuals of the image, but it's very easy to not read it, because it's unlike anything in the exhibit. It's unlike all the narrative that they have on the wall. So it's something you could walk by and not see and miss the work. You could miss it very easily, very easily. So next venue, I hope to have more input into it. And I went with my niece yesterday, and she was saying such good things, that while it's here, Sana, make this more active, make this more public. She said, for example, I go on the Historical Society site. She says, why is Cameron's pieces there and not yours? You should be there. On Wednesday, I go to a radio station to give a talk. All that. So she says, publicize it more, do more. She says, this person who's getting you to the radio station, that's the person that could probably make more venues around this while it's here in New York, because the Historical Society is not a museum people frequent. They go to the Met, the Martin, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, but the Historical Society is a little quiet treasure that people, and it's right next to natural history, but people don't puddle in there, not very much at all, not at all. And the time I've gone often on all my life, and I've become a member when I could afford it. I've been there maybe 10 times since the opening. I can count the minorities on one hand. They, for some reason, just don't go there. For some reason, and growing up in Queens and having trips to museums, it was never on the list to take any of us to that. Natural history, modern art, but never the Historical Society. And it's important. It's a great little intimate spot. I love it. I'm also going to talk to them. I was telling my niece yesterday, should I donate one of these pieces to the show? And she said, because we went to a room where they had new acquisitions, and I looked at them, and she said, Sana, read this. And I read it, and it says something about, this is our new acquisitions, we're always interested in it. She said, Sana, don't give, make them believe they have to have this piece. She says, everything's negotiable. So she says, next week you go in and say, this piece needs to be in this collection with this new acquisitions. How do we make this work? So that's just what I'm going to do. That's just what I'm going to do. No give. Now, of course, if they have zero money, which I know they don't have, which I know is not true, I would give the piece, because it's important for me to be with his work. 11 of the pieces in the show are from their collection. So that's why they were so interested. They didn't know either. who he was or his background. So I think that they should want a piece, but if not, it's important for me to never be separated from Cameron and what he made me make. Those pieces are not pieces that I would have ordinarily made. They are not. So I would like it to be a part of it, and I'd like for it to travel. I'm going to see if they get them to buy it.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of research on him. I did an interview with Mark last year or maybe 2 years ago about his research. There's a book that just came out by a gentleman down south. What is his name? Zaf is his last name, Zapf. I can't remember his first name, but I'm glad that people have put are highlighting his work, because the work is amazing. Like, as I'm a potter, and as a potter, I see those pots and I'm like, whoa. It, like, they just have that electricity of someone who intimately knows clay.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What I'm so impressed with is I call them shoulders. His pieces have such strong shoulders on them, and the lips and the handles are fluid and wet, as though it's somebody that just came out of the water. Just so seductive and so beautiful. And the cobalt blue that I put in my pieces is unusual for me to use it, but there's something about his ornamentation that is something that I've repeated over myself, all of us, the half moon shape, the circle, and all of the work. But the work is really stunningly beautiful, but real strong, tight shoulders. And I tried to make these pieces be tight and also to have that strength to them. Most of the time, my surfaces are very eaten on and tattered. Not in these pieces. They're highly burnished and hard. So I shifted. And I also, cone 6, I usually work in low fire. Those pieces went to cone 6 at another temperature range to be more in harmony with his. I could not get them salt fired because all my salt firing is done in other places away from, the city. But those other considerations I took in terms of color with the blue or turquoise, and then also with the idea of, temperature range and tightness and what I felt in his work. Yeah.
Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about?
A teeny bit, and you'll decide whether or not this is something you want to include. But what happened for me during the pandemic, in addition to being isolated and becoming emotionally ill, is that the George Floyd murder permeated the world. My friends in Thailand, Cambodia, Europe were out in the streets reacting to this. It couldn't be pushed under the rug. It couldn't be hidden. It couldn't be lied about. It affected everybody in different ways, and how it affected the art world is it made a dealer who has never shown a representational balance of people of color say, you know something, I got to change this. And so what happened is, for the first time in my career, 45 years, 50 years of working, blue chip white galleries were calling me. Would ever look at me before because my material clay dictated craft, or they felt like they had the one or two blacks that made them look essentially okay. And so they started approaching me, and they would invite themselves in some cases, and I would say yes, and they would come. And my studio's in the backyard, and one particular gallery came, and I walked him into the studio, and he looked attentively with everything, and I showed him 40 years of work that was here and talked about what it was. And then I said, okay, well, thank you for coming. And he said, well, no, I came to see the totems. And I said, I never made totems, sir. I'm sorry, it's the wrong artist. He says, no, you made totems. And then they reach into their bag and pull out their cell phone and show me a picture. And when I looked at it, it was my work from 45 years ago. And they said, where are these? And I looked at them. I said, oh, those are the house series. I made them, prior to going to graduate school. I made them before I committed to studying art. And they said, where are they? I said, well, I've got about maybe 8 in the living room. And I remember Eric Firestone walking past me, and he was new to my house, and he just walked past me to go to the living room. I just looked at him and said, wow, look at this. And I followed him, and he went right over to these pieces in the living room, and he looked at them, and he studied them, and I stood a distance behind him as he looked at them. And then he reached into his pocket as though he was reaching for money and said, I'll take these 3. And I looked at him and said, who told you they're for sale? Sit down. Let me tell you what I want. I said, I know what this is about. This is about your historical guilt in George Floyd's murder. And I'm not going to be your fucking example here today. How dare you come here and ask for work that was 40 years ago? I said, where were you 40 years ago? I said, 40 years ago. You're asking for work that's 40 years old. That means for 40 years, I've held a job 7 days a week, leaving the house at 9 o'clock in the morning, coming home at 2, depressed, unhappy, no children, no companion, and you won't work from 40 years ago. How old are you? You're not even old enough to know what was happening 40 years ago. It was probably your father or your grandfather. I said, I'm outraged and insulted your arrogance to tell me how much that you're going to buy these without asking a price. How dare you come in my home and do this? Leave. And so he got up, he humbled himself. He said, look, I can't change history, but I'm in a unique position to change your future if you would just think about this. I'm sorry, Sana. I'm just learning about you. I went to somebody and they said, look at you. And so I came. I'm sorry. And he walked out. And I just sat and cried. And that happened 3 more times. And I just cried. And then what he was doing, he was very clever. He got in touch with mid-career Black artists that have always, not always, that who made it over the hump. There are in blue chip galleries that have been doing well. And one of them was a colleague of mine from Hunter College. And he spoke to him, Nary Ward. And he said, look, I met Sana. I'm impressed with her. I'm impressed with the work. She's angry. She's hurt. And I understand it. But maybe if you would talk to her and tell her who I am, maybe she'll listen. Because why should she continue to have 6 jobs? Really what she should be doing is making art, not working so hard, and particularly at her age. And so they began to call me and talk to me, and they were very honorable. They respected where I felt. They knew my anger, but they did say, Sana, this is a time maybe for you. Maybe you've held on to all this work for really important reasons. Maybe it's time not to have 6 jobs. Maybe it's time to pay off the mortgage. Sana, just consider it, but I'll honor whatever decision you make. So it took me about 18 months to a year, and I decided to take the leap and try and move into these galleries and work with these people. And so it's kind of like I'm benefiting by the murder of George Floyd. It's really a mixed blessing. It's like when Ren calls me from Cambodia, and I can see she's been crying, and I know the money's run out, and she can't feed her children, or she can't continue to help her mother. And I'll hear it in her voice and see it in her expression that she needs an advance on her money. And I have no problem with the advance. My problem is, what are you going to do with the money? And when I find out that I'm going to send her $100 for her husband to make coal to sell, which is cancer causing, and that her and the 3 children will be out there with the kilns 24/7. It's an abomination that here I am trying to help her life be a better life. At the same time, I'm sending her $100 to kill herself down the road. And I cried and cried and cried as I went to Western Union to send that money, knowing they're going to make coal. I asked her, please don't take the children. Where is she going to not take the children? There's no babysitting. Please put shoes on them. They've never worn shoes. Put panties on them. They've never worn panties. Put something on your face, Ren, so you're not breathing. When I saw her, black was all around here, and the children, black in their ears. And so when I went to give that money, I just cried that here I am sending her money that will allow them to eat the next day, the next week, but also sending them $100 that maybe 10, 15, 20 years from now, one of them will develop respiratory problems from. So it's a double-ended blade. You don't know where to grab it. You don't know where to grab it. But what came to me after thinking about it and hurting over it is that I'm putting out the fire that's in front of me. And the fire immediately is that she needed to eat that day and the next day. I'll deal with the repercussions later on in life. So the George Floyd, it's a double-ended thing. I'm getting attention, but he was murdered. So.
Well, I do want to say that as I've interviewed people over the years, people look up to you in a way that I don't know if I'm sure you're aware of this, but you're an icon to so many younger artists in the way that you live your life. And I know that financially you got to make work, you got to sell work. That's all important. But I've got to say, you're a person that people bring up over and over and over again. Like, Sana is living a life that I want to live. And I think that I know that's not worth money, but I do think you are creating an impact in the work you do here, as well as the work you do in Cambodia and the other places you've worked. So I just wanted to kind of pass that along. I hope that people come up and tell you that, because they tell me that in the interviews.
Something? They don't tell me. They don't tell me at all. They don't tell me at all, but somebody else will tell me. Like, I don't know if you know Adira Willard.
I do, yeah. I just interviewed her. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Adira just told me 2 weeks ago. She said, "Son, do you have any idea of all the people that admire you?" And I said, "No, I don't. I don't. I just don't." And then this Dawn, who I called Effie, who just died, I went on her Facebook page and copied down everybody that she had written over the years and wrote them to let them know what had happened, and got her aunt in Michigan. And when I said, "Hello, my name is Sana," she screamed, "Sana's on the phone, Sana's on the phone." And this is my first time talking to her, Auntie Carolyn, but Sana's on the phone. They knew my life story. So Dawn brought Sana into her family world. So no, you don't always know. No one's ever come up to me and said it to me directly, but Adira just reminded me. And then just this experience with Dawn, when I called her auntie, who I've never met, and just gave her my name, and she shouted, "Sana's on the phone." She knew everything about me. So Dawn told her, Dawn shared that, So I'm happy if I'm some kind of a guide. I always say, I don't think of myself, I've never called myself a professor, not even a teacher. I've always thought of myself as a guide with the way that I move through the world. Just something for you to look at, observe, and pick the pieces that you want to do. So if I've been a guide, great. I've had many of them.
Well, I did want to mention also that your work will be at Nsika with the show that Adero has curated, which is Clay Holds Water, Water Holds Memory. So I'm looking forward to seeing that work. Are you going to be at Nsika this year?
Yeah, I'm going to go. I tried to pull out of it, but I say yes to everything when anybody calls me, then I forget. So when Adira and I talked maybe 6 months ago, and I said, "Oh yeah, well, I don't think I'm really going to NC." She said, "Sana, you're on the panel." I'm going. I'm going. I wouldn't be not doing anything. I love Adira. She's wonderful. She's just wonderful. She admires me immensely. She said to me when she brought me to Alfred, and I thanked her immensely, she said, "Sana, you don't have any idea how much more I would want to do. You don't know how important you are to me. You just don't know about those things." And people don't always say that, but it's wonderful. It's wonderful. I'm happy for that. I was at a watershed 2 summers ago, and I got in only because somebody was not going with the Color Network. And I was 45 years older than everybody there. And I looked around that table and said, "My God, look at this." And there was a little bit of ageism, but it was innocent. And it was actually from the top. They were concerned how I was every day with the young people. And I kept looking at them and saying, "You're not far from my age. What would you be like down in the studio? Come on. You're not far than me. Come on. I'm working. I'm doing okay." But down in the studio, they're in their 20s and they work bunches of hours and then they play bunches of hours. And I just always stayed at my station, but I was there and I would look over at them and I would smile, and we'd walk to lunch and dinner, and I'd come back and I'd work and I'd work and I'd work. And one night, one of the young ladies there said to me when we were leaving, she said, "Sana, I think this is so neat. You here hanging out with us?" So she's implying my age. And I looked at her and I said, "I'm not hanging out. I'm working." I'm working. And then another time they asked, "Well, what year were you here?" When I said, maybe 85, just thought a number. Somebody said, somebody grabbed their mouth. And then somebody else said, "I think my mother was born then." Said,
"Oh God,
you're lucky." So, but all of it is a gift. You know what I mean? All of it is a gift for me to be there with them, and a gift for them to have Sana in their life too. They're 3 weeks, and it was pretty wonderful. So yeah, I'll be at Nsika. The work that's at Nsika is not my strongest body of work, but it's a body of work that's important for me. It's pieces that I made through the pandemic, trying to heal. So it was just pinching clay, taking pinch pots, bring them together, looking at it as an oval, cutting them. You know how you put two forms together, and when you cut, the air comes out. But once I cut into a form and air gushed out of it, air gushed out of me. My shoulders went down. I didn't even know they were up. So I started making them for that gush. And then each one of those gushes, I felt better because I was marching. I wasn't able to work during the pandemic. When I studio, I felt healthy. To hear I was making a beautiful object and the world is outside burning up. I needed to march. The world didn't need an artist. They needed a marcher. And so after I'd made all these forms and gushed the air out of it, I then looked over in a corner and saw where I was not going to Cambodia, but was collecting the fabric to take with me. And sometimes I cut off the rotten, everything is recycled. Nothing is new. So I cut off the rotten areas and the remnants would be on the ground. And it reminded me of working with the girls in Cambodia that after we made 30 aprons, our feet are covered with remnants. And so I picked up this fabric as being memory, being them who I've missed. And I started packing it into the holes. So that's what's in the Nsika show. So I don't know if they're visually inviting or anything like that in comparison to the other things that I've done, but it was healing work for me. It was healing. So that's what they are. They're healing pieces. And she only selected one. And I just said, oh God, one is just not going to hold it up in this show. So I'm taking 4. At least 4 on a pedestal will have more of an impact than this little egg-shaped thing that's just sitting there and nobody knows the story, you know? So yes, are you going?
I am. Yeah, I'll be there.
You go every year?
When we had our daughter, I didn't go that year because I needed to be at home. But I do try to go somewhat regularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'll be there this year, and I know that I won't go next year because I only can go when they help me economically. I can't afford it, Tika. I just can't afford it. So, or if I'm giving a workshop, they usually give you, some money toward it. So this year, Adira was able to get $400, so it pays for my airfare and it pays for hotel, and then I have to eat here, so it's not like extra money, that I'm spending. So yeah, I will go this year, but I know I won't go next year, or I won't go until I'm invited. I can't afford it, but I do love going because I do meet friends from 30, 40 years ago and opportunities. It would be a place where I would go and I'd leave with 2 opportunities to give a lecture or visiting or opportunity or residency. So they're very important for me to go. And I've never been snobbish or elitist about clay as not being an important material as an art form. So I know a lot of people would say, why do you just go to a clay conference? Why don't you go to more conferences? I said, I do go to other conferences, but I'm at home at clay conferences. I'm at home.
Well, I appreciate your time today. This was a real honor to talk with you.
Thank you so much, Ben. It was nice to meet you. There's another Ben Carter, I think, that I know in Nsika from years and years ago. So when, who was it that spoke of you when you did the interview with Osa? Is that how you pronounce it?
Mm-hmm.
Osa, to Osa for her. And I said, and I don't know how it came out. I said, yeah, I'd like to. And I said, yeah, I know Ben. He's like a jovial, full-body black guy. She says, no, Sana, he's white. I said, oh, okay.
Yeah, Ben Carter is such a common name that I once went into a barbershop in Philadelphia because I was at Nsika. And I went in and I told him my name, and the guy looked at me like, is this a joke? Because another Ben Carter had an appointment at the exact same time the day before.
Yeah. Well, there's another Ben Carter in Nsika who's full body. I said, oh, that black woman. No, Sana. She was just so fun. No, Sana, he's white. Okay, no problem.
Well, I'm gonna have to meet this other Ben. That would be
He's
good.
jovial and wonderful. I hope I see him in Nsika and I'll tell him the story.
Okay, definitely. I'd like to thank Sana for coming on the show. It was a pleasure to chat with her, and I certainly appreciate the open heart that she brought to this interview, as well as her art making and activism that is such a gift to the ceramic world. If you'd like to keep in touch with Sana, you can follow her on Instagram. That's Sana Musasama. Also wanted to take a minute and thank our sponsors. Today we're sponsored by Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Art. If you or your organization is interested in sponsoring an episode of this show, or any of the ones on the Brickyard Network, you can get in touch through our website, which is brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.